The clock struck exactly 7 in the evening when I heard the sound of keys turning in the lock. My heart raced, and my hands instinctively gripped the edge of the kitchen sink. Davy never liked coming home to silence. He wanted to be greeted, with smiles, with dinner served, and with a flawless wife, as if every detail of my existence revolved around pleasing him. I swallowed hard and tried to keep a neutral expression as he entered. The woody scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the subtle aroma of whiskey. He had been drinking. His posture was lofty, confident as always, the same confidence of someone who feels above any consequences. "How was your day?" I asked, as I did every night. My voice came out calm, trained over the years to sound submissive, predictable. He didn't even look at me. He went straight to the dining table, tossing his keys onto the solid wood surface with a dull thud. "The same as always," he replied, taking off his blazer and rolling up the sleeves of his designer shirt. "Had meetings, closed deals, and had to deal with an incompetent fool who couldn't deliver a decent report. Wasted too much time explaining the obvious to idiots." I nodded, saying nothing. I knew he didn't want a conversation, just an audience for his greatness. That was Davy, a man who fed on his own self-importance and believed the world revolved around him. In the early years of our marriage, I tried to fit into the mold he demanded. I put my career aside, abandoned my friends, distanced myself from my family. I did everything to be the perfect wife, but no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. There was always something wrong, the tone of my voice, the way I chopped vegetables, how I folded his shirts, small details that, to him, were signs that I wasn't trying hard enough. I remembered the first time he raised his voice at me. It was during a dinner with some businessmen. I had made a comment about investments in the real estate sector, something I knew well, because before marriage, I had been a lawyer in the field. Davy gave a half smile, placed his hand over mine, and squeezed it tightly. "Let the men talk." "About this, dear," he said, his tone too sweet to be genuine. The pressure on my hand was a warning. In the car on the way home, he made sure to remind me that I should know my place. And since then, I had learned. Until now. I had spent the last few days rehearsing every detail of what I would say to him that night. Knowing that a new life was growing inside me made me see things more clearly. For the first time, I had a real reason to change my life, to escape that prison before it was too late. "I have something to tell you," I said, trying to control the tension in my voice. Davy lifted his eyes from his phone and glanced at me without real interest. "Say it already." I took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the chair to keep my hands from trembling. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. The air in the room felt heavier, and I saw Davy's expression shift. First, disbelief. Then something darker, more dangerous. He slowly stood up, like a predator analyzing its prey. "Are you joking?" His voice came out low, threatening. I shook my head. "No. I took the test this morning. I'm pregnant, Davy." He laughed, not a laugh of happiness, but a cold, scornful laugh. He walked toward me, his eyes burning with fury. "That child isn't mine, you wretch." My stomach turned. "What are you talking about?" My voice came out weaker than I wanted. Davy leaned in, bringing his face close to mine, and the strong smell of alcohol he had consumed before coming home hit me. "I'm sure you cheated on me with another man." The accusation took me by surprise, but before I could react, the impact came. The punch hit my face so fast I didn't have time to defend myself. My body was thrown backward, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Everything spun. The floor seemed to disappear beneath my feet. Pain exploded in my head, but more than that, it was the realization within me that struck hardest. I had never been safe with him. Never. Davy looked down at me, his chest heaving, as if deciding whether to say something. But he didn't. He just grabbed his keys from the table and left, slamming the door shut. And at that moment, as I held the throbbing side of my face and felt the warmth of blood trickling from the corner of my lips, I realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. I was no longer the woman who accepted things in silence. No longer the wife who apologized for existing. That night, I looked in the mirror and made a vow to myself. If Davi thought he could destroy me, he had no idea what was coming. The silence in the house was deafening. I sat there, on the cold living room floor, feeling the metallic taste of blood spreading in my mouth. My skin throbbed where Davy's fist had struck, and a thin red trail trickled from the corner of my lips. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but my breathing was still unsteady. Not because of the blow itself, but because of the certainty that this would never end. I ran my fingers along the side of my face and felt the swelling forming. Slowly, my mind started reorganizing, analyzing what had just happened. I knew he was controlling, knew his rage was a constant threat ready to explode, but never before had it reached this point. Never before had he hit me with such brutality. Something inside me died at that moment. I didn't cry. The shock and pain tried to paralyze me, but another sensation was growing inside me, spreading through my body like a fire ready to consume everything. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness, it was hatred. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house, and I knew I was alone. He had left, probably to some bar or one of his secret apartments I had always pretended not to know about. I stood up slowly, supporting myself on the edge of the table. My steps were slow, every muscle in my body tense. I walked to the hallway, mirror, and stared at my reflection. The face looking back at me was not that of a broken woman. It was of someone who had finally awakened. I examined the cut at the corner of my lip, the red mark that would soon turn into a dark bruise on the side of my face. But beyond that, I saw the determination in my eyes. Davi thought he controlled me. He believed I was his possession, a doll. He could display and discard whenever he pleased. He thought he was in control of my life, my destiny. He was wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed the number that had been saved in my contacts for a long time, one I had never had the courage to use. The call was answered on the third ring. Alice? The voice on the other end was serious, firm. I need your help. My voice was steady, without hesitation. Did he hurt you? There was a long silence before I answered. I didn't need to say anything more. I just heard a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Meet me at the usual place. We'll take care of this. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection for another second. Davy believed I would spend the night hiding, cowering in fear, waiting for his empty apologies and broken promises. But he had no idea that while he thought he had destroyed me, I was already taking the first step toward destroying everything. He had. I grabbed my purse, wiped the blood from my lips, and walked out the door. He didn't know it yet, but he had just dug his own downfall. The early morning air was cold when I arrived at our designated meeting place. The dimly lit parking lot of the old office where I had worked before marriage looked even more ominous at this hour. But I didn't hesitate. The engine of my car went silent, and my fingers tightened around the steering wheel. I took a deep breath before stepping out. My heels clicked against the asphalt, the sound echoing in the emptiness. A black car was parked a few meters away, and Mariana was already there, leaning against the door of the vehicle. She looked me up and down, saying nothing as she opened the passenger door for me. I got in. As soon as I pulled the door shut behind me, Mariana turned, her dark eyes scanning my face, locking onto the red mark forming on the side. I knew this day would come. Her voice was cold, but there was something else beneath it. Anger. I crossed my arms, turning my gaze to the window. So did I replied. She started the car and drove off. Silence stretched between us for several minutes. Mariana had been my mentor when I started practicing law years ago. A strong, relentless woman, someone who would never allow herself to be broken by a man like Davy. But I hadn't been like her. Mariana was the only one who never believed in the perfect image of my marriage. She saw beyond appearances. When she found out I was leaving my career to become Davy Albuquerque's wife, she tried to warn me. She tried to stop me, but I didn't. Listen. Tell me. She finally broke the silence. What do you want to do? I let out a deep breath, staring straight ahead. Destroy him. My words came out low but firm. Destroy him so he never gets back up again. Mariana didn't look surprised. She just nodded, as if she had been expecting that answer. I need evidence, I continued. Something that will ruin his image, leave him with no way out. The video of the assault is a start, but it won't be enough. He has contacts. He has money. I need something bigger. Mariana kept one hand on the wheel while grabbing her phone with the other. She typed something quickly, then looked at me. Fraud, Alice. I've always suspected his company isn't clean. My eyes met hers, and for the first time that night, a flicker of hope ran down my spine. Can you get proof? Mariana smirked, a humorless smile. I'm already on it. I leaned my head against the car seat, closing my eyes for a moment. I knew I couldn't rely on justice alone to protect me. Davy would walk out of the police station the next day with a high-priced lawyer ensuring the assault would be swept under the rug. But it didn't matter. He could leave jail tomorrow, the same night, or in a few hours. Because by the time he stepped outside, I would already have begun dismantling his life. I wasn't afraid anymore, and that would be his downfall. The sun was beginning to rise when I arrived home. The sky was still a mix of dark and orange hues, and the city was waking up slowly, but I didn't allow myself to feel the weight of exhaustion. My hands were steady as I turned the key in the lock. The silence of the house wrapped around me. The moment I stepped inside, and only then did I release the breath I had been holding since I left the car. Davy hadn't returned yet. Perfect. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the chill of the marble floor beneath my feet. I walked through the hallway and stopped in front of the bedroom door. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the space I had shared with him for years. The place where, for so long, I had lain beside a man who swore he loved me while slowly erasing my essence. But that would end today. I stepped closer to the bed and slid open the nightstand drawer, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. They had been there for months, bought by Davy in one of his controlling impulses. He liked the feeling of dominance. Funny how things change. I worked quickly. Restraining a man of Davy's size wouldn't be easy if he were awake, but drunk. And exhausted, he wouldn't put up much of a fight. The cuffs snapped onto his wrists perfectly, secured to the iron bars of the headboard. The chain was short enough to limit his movements, but not enough to stop him from struggling. And that was exactly what happened when he woke up. The sound of the chains rattling alerted me before he even opened his eyes. First, a groan, then a sharp tug. Then, the hollow clang of the chain hitting the iron. Davy frowned, his eyes still heavy with sleep and alcohol. The confusion on his face was quickly replaced by pure shock when he tried to move and realized he couldn't. He blinked several times as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Alice? His voice was hoarse, still weighed down by exhaustion. Good morning, love. I calmly sat in the bedroom armchair, crossing my legs and watching every detail of his reaction. The shock, the disbelief, the anger. It was almost comical. What the hell do you think you're doing? He yanked at the chains again, his face twisting in fury. I tilted my head slightly, as if analyzing the situation. That seems obvious. Davy clenched his teeth, his eyes burning with rage as they locked onto mine. Let me go now, Alice, before you what? I swallowed the laughter that threatened to escape and stood up slowly, walking over to the table beside me. "I brought something for you to watch," I murmured, picking up my phone and sliding the screen. The video started playing, and the room filled with the sound of his own voice. Aggressive, cruel. "That child isn't mine, you wretch." The sound of the impact, the noise of my body hitting the floor, the cutting silence that followed. I watched as Davy listened to every second of it. I saw his breathing falter when the video ended. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't mean anything," he spat, trying to regain control. "Oh, Davy." I shook my head slowly, as if I felt sorry for him. "It means everything." I tossed a pile of papers onto him. "Here's the police report, and here the divorce papers. Oh, and I almost forgot." I leaned in slightly, looking straight into his eyes. "I've already filed a request for an investigation into your company. Fraud, embezzlement. You know what I'm talking about." For the first time, I saw panic flash in his eyes. It was subtle, but I caught it. He shifted, yanking at the chains harder, the metal grinding against the iron bed frame. "You ruined my life," he hissed, his voice low, dripping with hatred. "No, love." I smiled slowly, checking the time on my phone. The doorbell rang. "You did that yourself." I stood up and walked toward the door, leaving Davy struggling behind me. He thought he could destroy me, but he had no idea the real game was just beginning. The doorbell rang again, insistently. The sound echoed through the house, and for a brief second I looked at Davy. His expression flickered between rage and fear, an interesting contrast for someone who always believed he was in control. I turned and walked down the stairs calmly, ignoring the muffled shouts he let out behind me. When I opened the door, 2 police officers stared at me seriously. One of them, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, held a clipboard. "Mrs. Alice Albuquerque?" he asked, and I nodded. "We have a warrant for your husband's arrest on charges of domestic violence. May we come in?" I stepped aside without hesitation, and they headed up the stairs without delay. The sound of the cuffs being unlocked, Davy's protests, and the heavy footsteps of the officers mixed with the stillness of the house. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, listening to every detail. "This is ridiculous," Davy roared, his voice thick with rage and desperation. "Do you know who I am? My lawyer will put an end to this nonsense." "You have the right to remain silent," one of the officers said firmly. "I suggest you use that right before you make things worse for yourself." And then, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Davy was dragged down the stairs, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time, there was no arrogance in them, just disbelief. "You'll regret this," he whispered as he passed me, his voice dripping with venom. "I highly doubt that," I replied, not looking away. I watched as he was placed in the police car and driven away. The door to the house closed behind me, and silence filled the space once again. But I knew that quiet wouldn't last. Davy wasn't the type of man to accept losing, and I was sure his next move wouldn't take long. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted. Running my fingers over my face, I felt the swelling where he had hit me. The physical pain was no longer what bothered me the most. What bothered me was knowing he wouldn't give up so easily. The next day, the first headline I saw in the newspapers was a blatant attempt to twist the narrative. "Vengeful wife sets up CEO and gets him arrested." I swallowed a dry laugh. Of course, he would use the media to his advantage. That's what he always did. I picked up my phone and dialed a number that had now become part of my routine. "He's already making his move," I said as soon as Mariana answered. "I saw," she replied, "and you're going to love what I found." There was a satisfied tone in her voice, and for the first time in days, I smiled. The game was far from over. And I still had plenty of cards to play. Mariana didn't waste any time. When I arrived at her office, everything was already prepared. A pile of documents lay on her desk, and her eyes carried a predatory gleam. "You wanted something big, Alice? Here it is." I sat across from her, feeling my heartbeat quicken as I flipped through the pages. Everything was there. Suspicious transactions, offshore accounts, forged contracts, bribes disguised as political donations. The kind of dirt that wouldn't just ruin Davy's image. It would put him at the center of a federal investigation. "Enough to bury him for good?" I asked, feeling a cold rush of adrenaline course through my veins. "Enough to ensure he never has power over anything again, least of all you." I scanned every detail, absorbing the information. This was it, the final piece of my plan. Davy had played dirty, manipulating the media and trying to paint me as the villain, but he underestimated my patience. Mariana handed me a flash drive. "The digital files are all here, but I've already sent copies to contacts I have at the Federal Revenue Service and the prosecutor's office. By now, they're all ready, analyzing everything." "That means he won't see this coming." She smiled, crossing her arms. "Exactly." I took the flash drive, pressing it between my fingers. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. "Now, we just need to make sure the right press gets this." Mariana nodded. "I've got it all planned. By tomorrow morning, this will be in every headline in the country." I left her office feeling the lightness of someone finally seeing the finish line. But at the same time, something inside me whispered that Davy wouldn't just sit back and watch his downfall. He would try to strike back, and I was ready for his final move. The next morning, everything exploded. CEO under investigation for corruption and money laundering. Businessman Davy Albuquerque could face up to 20 years in prison. The fraud behind an empire. Documents reveal financial crimes in a multi-million-dollar company. The reaction was immediate. Investors pulled their money from the company. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, and before noon, Davy had already been removed from his position. He was no longer the all-powerful magnate. He was just a desperate man, cornered, with no way out. But I knew he wouldn't go down quietly, and it didn't take long for his call to come. His name flashed on my phone screen. I answered without hurry, putting him on speaker as I gazed out at the horizon from my apartment window. "You paid me back in kind, Alice." His voice was low, controlled, but filled with suppressed fury. "No, Davy," I replied, without a hint of hesitation. "I went beyond that." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think you won?" "I know I did." The silence on the other end made me smile. He knew. For the first time in his life, Davy knew he had lost. But I also knew there was one last move to make. And I would make it at the right moment. The courtroom was packed. The constant murmurs of the press, lawyers, and witnesses echoed through the hall, creating a palpable tension in the air. I sat firmly in the victim's section, my posture upright, my gaze unwavering. I had waited months for this day. Davy sat on the defendant's bench, but he no longer carried his usual arrogance. His expensive suit couldn't hide the paleness of his skin or the deep shadows under his eyes. The man who once boasted of being untouchable was now nothing but a shadow of his former self. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading the verdict. My breathing remained steady, but my hands pressed together as the final words echoed through the room. Guilty of domestic assault, tax fraud, money laundering, and bribery of public officials, sentenced to 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10. A sigh rippled through the courtroom. Lawyers jotted down notes, journalists began typing, and I simply closed my eyes for a brief second. It was over. Davy said nothing. He didn't shout, didn't protest. He simply lowered his head, his shoulders tense, as if finally understanding there was no way out. As he was escorted away by officers, our eyes met for one last moment. There was no hatred in mine, no bitterness, just a silent warning. You lost. I walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The days that followed were a whirlwind. My name was still in the newspapers, but now with a different narrative. I had gone from vengeful villain to survivor. My video exposing the abuse became a symbol for many women, and soon, invitations for speeches, interviews, and projects started flooding in. But I didn't want that, at least not yet. What I wanted was to start over. I moved into a new apartment, simpler, cozier. A place where every corner belonged only to me, where I didn't have to walk on eggshells or pretend to be someone I wasn't. The pregnancy was progressing well. Feeling the tiny movements inside me reminded me every day why I had fought so hard. My child would never know the shadow of Davy, would never grow up in an environment of fear and control. Mariana stayed by my side. When we met at the cafe we used to frequent years ago, she handed me a folder full of papers. "The final piece," she said, crossing her arms. I opened the document and read every line carefully. Davy hadn't just lost his company. He had lost everything. Frozen accounts, confiscated assets, every single investment crumbling to dust. The empire he had built on corruption and arrogance was reduced to nothing. "You know what he said before they took him?" "Away?" Mariana asked, taking a sip of her coffee. I shook my head. That one day he'd get out and come back for revenge. I let out a slow breath, turning my cup in my hands. "He can try," I murmured. "But by then, I'll be even stronger." She smiled, and we clinked our cups together in silent agreement. A pact between victors. Months passed, and when I held my son in my arms for the first time, I knew I had won. He would never know what it was like to live in fear, would never have to watch his mother lower her head for anyone. I looked at his tiny face, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. We were free, and this was just the beginning.